All right, class, welcome back. We are going to get into Unit 2, which is on Reformation and Enlightenment. Most likely cut this one in half. So let's start with the Reformation first. Before we get into the Reformation, quick note about slavery. Slavery came up in the last unit. Regarding Columbus and the triangle trade, etc. And I pointed out that slavery was universal among all cultures everywhere for all of human history until relatively recently. In terms of how it was practiced in the Americas, and again, not just in the United States, but in the Caribbean and South America, etc. So that whole transatlantic slave trade, the triangle trade, etc., of slaves being taken out of West Africa, sent to the Americas. The percentage of slaves taken out of West Africa that ended up in what became the United States was less than 5%. The overwhelming majority, more than 95% of slaves taken out of West Africa that were sent to the Americas were sent to the Caribbean, Brazil, etc. So American slavery is referring not just to what happened in what became the United States, but what was going on before the United States even existed, especially in the Caribbean and South America. So slavery is universal, but there was something unique about how slavery was practiced in the United States. So some compare and contrast with other types of slavery. Slaves in the Americas generally were not assimilated into society. And one example of a contrast would be like India. Slavery was practiced in India as it was everywhere else. But in India and in other places, but India, for example, there was a way for slaves to be assimilated into society, for them to work off their bondage, to become free and to become equal members to society. That wasn't really a practice in the Americas. In the Americas, usually slavery was a lifelong condition that was unique. Another unique thing and a very insidious thing was that in the Americas, slavery was explicitly tied to race. In other words, only Africans were enslaved. And that was unique, right? Not all Africans were slaves in the Americas, but all slaves were Africans. There was an explicit tie to race. Unlike, among other places, the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, there was slavery, as there was everywhere else, but there was no way to look at a person's physical appearance in the Roman Empire and to predict whether or not they were a slave. Anybody could be enslaved in the Roman Empire, and anybody could be free in the Roman Empire. There was no explicit connection to race. Another unique thing about slavery in the Americas is that there was a 2-to-1 approximately male to female ratio. There were about twice as many male slaves as female slaves. That was kind of a unique scenario. Um, in the Islamic world, for example, there were huge amounts of slaves, but there wasn't this imbalance between male and female the way there was in the Americas. And if you think about that gender imbalance, that's going to lead to very unstable family structures, etc. And the last thing is that slavery in the Americas was inherited from parents. In Africa, for example, and other places, that wasn't necessarily the case rather. So in other places where slavery was practiced, if your parents were slaves, that doesn't mean that you are a slave by birth. And in the Americas, that was the case. So nothing unique about the fact that there was slavery in the Americas, but these are just some attributes of American slavery that were distinct from how slavery was practiced elsewhere. So we'll spend most of this section on the Reformation. The Reformation was a political movement. And if you're not interested, or religious, I should say, a religious movement. And if you're not interested in religion, That's okay, because the ideas introduced by the Reformation go way beyond religion. Okay, but let's start with the basics here. The Reformation was from the beginning a plural movement with diverse ideas. Luther, that references Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German Catholic priest who is credited with starting what we now know as the Reformation. Luther himself often reacted harshly to those who disagreed with him, labeling them heretics or fanatics or satanic. Wow. Okay. So let's start with the image here first. From the beginning of Christianity all the way up until about 500 years ago, the Catholic Church essentially had a monopoly on Christianity. I'm going to oversimplify this a little bit, but basically the only church was the Catholic Church. In other words, if you were Christian, you were Catholic. There was no competition. What the Protestant Reformation did, you can see this image here, it branches out. So there's no longer just one tree, one trunk. Now there are different branches shooting off of the Christian tree, if you will. Protestant opened the door to, now instead of just the Catholic Church, now there's the Catholic and the Protestant Church. And it's not just that there are two options, Catholic or Protestant. The Protestant option, if you can see the graphic here, very quickly subdivides into dozens of different denominations. So for all of the history of Christianity, essentially every Christian was a Catholic, with very few exceptions. What the Protestant Reformation did was introduce competition, diversity. Now you could be Catholic or Protestant. And if you're Protestant, well, you might be a Lutheran, you might be a Presbyterian, you might be Episcopalian, you might be Methodist, you might be Southern Baptist, and on and on and on. So it divides Christianity from one core thing into dozens and dozens of different variations. Now, Luther, Martin Luther, the German priest who began this movement, he broke off from the Catholic Church and founded his own denomination called Lutheran. But then anyone else who disagreed with him and tried to do the same thing that he did, in other words, branch off and form their own churches, well, he didn't like that, right? This is human nature sometimes. It's okay if I do it, it's not okay if you do it. Rules for thee, not for me. So Luther broke off from the Catholic Church and he felt justified in doing that. But then anyone who disagreed with him and wanted to break away from him, he would call them a heretic or a fanatic or satanic. There are intellectual, economic, political, ideological ramifications to these ideas that go, as I said, far beyond just, quote, religious. And those ideas we can describe as anti-hierarchical, pro-egalitarian. So I'll flesh this out in a minute. The Reformation introduced these ideas anti-hierarchy because the Catholic Church was very hierarchical, and pro-egalitarian, giving more power to more people. And that goes way beyond religion, right? There's lots of different manifestations of that. Among other things, the Protestant Reformation was a revolt against the concept of monopoly. We'll get into that in a minute. There are economic and political ramifications to that big picture idea. And where else can we observe this attitude, this anti-hierarchy, pro-egalitarian attitude? So we'll walk through all of these things. Monopolies. In the context of the Reformation, the Catholic Church had a monopoly on Christianity. It was the only show in town. If you were Christian, you had to be Catholic. There was no competition. In the economic sphere, that's usually when you hear this term monopoly, it usually has to do with business. In the West, in the United States, let's say, monopolies are usually illegal and they are considered in theory to be dangerous and inefficient. And we'll walk through a thought exercise here. What if Apple had a monopoly on cell phones? What if the only smartphone available was the iPhone? Now, the iPhone is dominant. I would guess that the majority of you have iPhones, but the point I want you to think about here is you don't need to have an iPhone. You can have the closest competition, as I understand, is probably Samsung Galaxy. I don't know. But there are other types of phones that you can get. If for some reason you don't like the iPhone, you can get a Samsung, let's say. There is competition. What if there weren't? What if the only phone on the market was the iPhone? You have to buy the iPhone. There's no alternative. In theory, what would happen to the price? Well, however much iPhones cost now, in theory, if there's no competition, Apple could jack up the price. If you remember the example I walked you through in the last unit with the triangle trade, and there were monopolies set up, if you remember the example, Cuba had to sell sugar to Spain, and Cuba had to buy rum from Spain. Well, in those systems, when there's monopolies, the prices can be very unfair because you have no alternative. So in theory, a monopoly could jack up prices unfairly, and there's nothing you can do about it because there's no competition, there's no alternative. What about the quality? Same idea. If you have a monopoly, the monopoly has no interest in making really high quality products because you have to buy them whether they're high quality or not. Innovation. If you have a monopoly, you don't really have an incentive to invest time and money on research and development to make better products because the customer has to buy from you anyway because you're the only option. So in theory, this is why monopolies are not usually allowed in the West in the economic realm. They can rip you off and they can produce low quality products and there's nothing you can do about it. In theory. Now, I want you to, one more theoretical thing about the economic aspect here. And this goes to how companies make money in theory, okay? In theory, companies don't make money by ripping you off. In theory, companies make money by providing you the best possible product at the lowest possible price. And it's not because they love you and they care about you, it's because they want your money. Whatever the iPhone does, if an iPhone is on sale for $1,000 and it does certain things, the competition, Samsung, let's say, the people at Samsung are trying desperately to create a phone as good as the iPhone and sell it to you for $800 for less money. Not because they love you, because they want your money. And if they can provide you a equal or better quality product for less money, you're going to switch to them. You're going to switch to the competition. And now they have money in their pockets. So that's what businesses in theory are trying to do if they're competing. They're trying to get you a better product for less money because that's how they get your business. Revolutions. The Protestant Reformation was a revolution. It changed religion, it changed society. It was a revolutionary movement. Revolutions need a medium through which to spread their ideas. A more current example would be in Egypt. In 2011, there was a revolution in which the government was overthrown. And as you can see in the image here, the people in the streets that organized to overthrow this government, what medium, what technology that allows people to communicate, basically, what medium were they using? Well, at the time, social media was essentially brand new, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And the people in Egypt in 2011 used this new medium, this new method of communication to spread their ideas. In the context of Martin Luther, the new medium, the new way to communicate and spread ideas was the printing press. We didn't talk a lot about the printing press. I don't think we've talked about it at all, actually. It is one of the most important inventions in human history. It changed society more than almost any other invention you could possibly name. The internet is kind of the modern manifestation of the printing press. The printing press allowed books to be mass produced for the first time in human history. And it was developed right at the same time as Martin Luther is developing these new ideas to break away from the Catholic Church. And Martin Luther understood the power of the printing press. It allowed him to mass produce his writings and therefore to distribute them to previously impossible numbers of people. And that's how Martin Luther spread his ideas. So, whatever your ideas are, whether they're good ideas, bad ideas, whatever they are, if you want to change the world and you want to convince people to follow some new way of looking at things, if you're smart, you're going to take advantage of whatever the newest medium is to allow you to communicate with the greatest number of people. 500 years ago, that's the printing press. 100 years ago, it's the radio. Now it's the internet. Here's another example of revolutions being spread with media. The civil rights movement in the United States. The new medium at the time, 1950s, early 1960s, was TV. Images like this. There was nothing new about what you see in this image. There was nothing new about this. What was new in the 50s and early 60s was the medium of television. And what was new was that all of a sudden, when things like what you see pictured here happened, the new medium of television allowed average, everyday people to see it. To see it. You don't need to be there in person. You can be sitting on your couch eating dinner and you can watch this on the news. Right? So, printing press, radio, then TV, now internet. If you can figure out how to use the latest medium of communication, your ideas will travel far and wide. In terms of the specific reasons that Martin Luther cited for breaking away from the Catholic Church, specific grievances. A grievance is a complaint. People that start revolutions do so because they are not happy with the current state of affairs. All right. Happy people don't start revolutions. So people that start revolutions are going to have grievances and complaints. When we get to the American Revolution, the next unit after next, the Declaration of Independence, a lot of that document, we'll cover it, is Thomas Jefferson listing grievances, listing complaints against the British. Martin Luther did a similar thing. He's writing his complaints against the Catholic Church. And here are some of his grievances. This term clerical has to do with clergy, that has to do with priests. He's saying that some priests were immoral. Now, I think this is worth taking a moment to think about. Some priests were immoral. Okay, well, priests are people and some people are immoral. That's unavoidable, right? In the big picture, I would ask you to think about now, because you see this all throughout your life. Can you separate the art from the artist? Can you separate the person, the artist, from their job, the art? And maybe sometimes yes, sometimes no, depends on the situation. So let me give you a couple examples and then we'll get back to this specific issue that Luther had. Can you, well, let's go through a couple jobs. You have a mechanic that is very good at fixing your car. They do it quickly. They don't try to rip you off. They do a really good job. They charge you a fair price. You're very happy with this mechanic. That's the art. The art here in this example is they're really, really good at fixing your car. The artist is the mechanic himself. What if you find out that you're a mechanic who's great at fixing your car? What if you find out that they're a terrible person in their private life? Can you separate the art from the artist? Can you say, geez, my mechanic's really a scumbag, but he's a great mechanic, so I'm gonna keep going to him? Or do you say, man, you know what? I really like this mechanic. He's great at his job, but I just found out that he's a really bad person in his private life. I can't do business with him anymore. Can you separate out? What about a president? A lot of people want the president at any given time to be a really good, upstanding, moral role model. Wouldn't that be nice? Is that the job? Is that the job of the president to be a good person in their private conduct? It'd be nice if all presidents were morally upright people, but I have bad news for you. A lot of them aren't. Can you separate that out? Can you say, for example, um, yeah, Bill Clinton, boy, his private behavior regarding women, oh, not good. Really, really, really immoral. However, when he was president, the economy was really good, so, you know, he's fine. Or do you say, you know what? Anyone who behaves that way in private, the way Bill Clinton behaves, I don't care if the economy's good or not, they can't be my president. It's a very complicated question, actually. Let me give you one more example and then we'll get back to this. Um, think about your favorite musical artist. You like their art, it makes you happy, it inspires you, whatever it is. But you find out in their private personal life, oh boy, bad person. What do you do? Do you stop listening to their music? I remember this being an issue regarding Michael Jackson, who was one of the most popular musical artists in all human history, but was pretty credibly accused, never convicted, but pretty credibly accused of some really immoral behavior, to put it lightly. What do you do with that? Do you throw out the art because the artist is a bad person? It's pretty complex stuff, right? I urge you to think about that. Um, because if your standard is any person who engages in immoral conduct, we need to reject their life's work, well, I got bad news. That's pretty much everyone who's ever lived. But in this context, the priest, can you separate the art from the artist if the priest is immoral? This is a lot harder than if your auto mechanic is immoral. And here's why. The job of the mechanic is to fix your car, not to be a good husband, let's say. The job of the priest, it's a little more complicated. The job of the priest is to model and practice and preach good moral behavior. So if they are immoral, that's a problem in a way that maybe it's not a problem if the mechanic is immoral. You see where I'm going with this? A priest being immoral, that's literally the job. A priest being immoral is the equivalent not of a auto mechanic cheating on his wife. It's the equivalent of you take your car to the mechanic for an oil change and the mechanic says, I don't know how to do an oil change. Like, dude, that's the job, right? The job of the priest is morality. So if they're immoral, it's not like, oh, my favorite, movie star is a bad person, but I'm still going to enjoy their movie. It's a much more serious problem. And that's what Luther is pointing out. Immoral priests, that undermines the legitimacy of the church. Clerical ignorance. Some priests were not properly educated, and this is a pre-literate society. Almost everyone's illiterate, and there was an expectation that the priest would be the best educated person you've ever met, and if they're not, that's a problem for the credibility of the institution. Clerical pluralism, plural meaning more than one. A lot of priests were put in charge of 3, 4, 5 different parishes, different churches, and that's just corrupt. You can't be in 4 or 5 places at once every Sunday for mass, and that's going to, again, undermine the credibility of the institution. If someone goes to mass and there's no priest there, it's a problem. Some priests were exempt from certain taxes and military service. That's rules for thee, not for me. That causes frustration and resentment. Priests were appointed by Rome, not locals. So the idea here was that the Catholic Church was too hierarchical, too top down, and that local people should have more control over who their leaders were. In other words, I'll give you a modern political example. I don't know where you guys live. I'm originally from Providence, Rhode Island. So let's say this. Who chooses the mayor of Providence? The locals, right? The people that live in Providence. They live there. They know what they want. They know what they need. They're in charge of picking their leaders. What Luther is arguing here, he's complaining that priests were appointed by Rome, by Vatican City, the center of the church, not the local people. What he's saying is this would be the equivalent in the modern American context of the mayor of Providence not being voted for by people that live in Providence, but being appointed by the president of the United States, by the top of the hierarchy, right? And the question is, what does the president of the United States know about Providence, Rhode Island? Has the president ever been to Providence? Probably not. They don't know what's going on. And what Luther was saying is, what does the Pope know about some village in France? Why is the Pope choosing the priests? The people that actually live there should have more power. And the last issue is clerical sales of indulgences. The church had a practice back then of essentially selling forgiveness of sins. And Luther found that to be incredibly corrupt. So these are all things that Luther was complaining about that in his mind made the church corrupt and cut it off from the needs of average everyday Catholics. And this is a abbreviated list of his grievances, his complaints that caused him to break off. And so again, what was for 1500 years one thing, Christianity, Catholic Church, now became two things, Catholic or Protestant. And then that Protestant branch immediately began subdividing Lutherans, and then a guy named John Calvin broke off from Luther and formed a Calvinist sect. And then there's, within 100 years, a couple hundred other variations. So the major differences, theological differences, and this goes way beyond religion. And I'll walk you through this, and you'll start to notice, I think, a trend. Catholics are very hierarchical, top down, and Protestants are more egalitarian, right? Center out. Where does authority come from? According to Catholics, the Bible, that shouldn't surprise you, and rituals and teachings of the church. So for Catholics, the Bible, of course, you need the Bible, but you have to go to Mass. The sacraments are important. Baptism, confirmation, confession, Eucharist, etc. You have to go to Mass. It's not sufficient to just know the Bible, okay? And as a Catholic, just take my word for it, all right? I haven't missed a Mass in years. This is important for Catholics. The ritual and the institution is a major part of it. It's not just the book, okay? For Protestants, this is much more direct, much more egalitarian. Protestants say, no, you don't need the institution. You don't need the rituals. You don't need to get caught up in all that. You just need the Bible. It's much more direct, much more streamlined. What is the church? Catholics, again, it's the hierarchy. It's the institution that goes all the way back to the beginning, to Peter, the first pope, who was appointed to be so by Jesus. Goes all the way back to the beginning. And it's an unbroken line of that institution for over 2,000 years. That's the church. Protestants, again, much more direct, much more democratic. The church is an organic community. It's a natural thing. It's not about any specific person. It's not about any specific place. You could have 3 people sitting in a basement talking about the Bible. That's church. It's much more direct, much more democratic. Who can interpret the Bible? This is the one that I'll use as an example to show you how this goes way beyond religion. Who can interpret the Bible? According to Catholics, Catholic priests. That's their job. It's the job of the clergy to interpret the Bible. The Protestants, look how democratic this is. No. Any person can interpret the Bible. All right. We're going to take that one issue and expand that, and hopefully you'll see how these ideas go way beyond religion. Last thing, in what language should the Bible be written and should church services be conducted? The Catholics say Latin. That was the language of the church. Protestants say the reader, if we're talking about you're reading the Bible, or if the worshiper, if you're at church, the religion, whether it's written or spoken, should be in your vernacular language. That's your first language, the language in which you are most fluent and literate. In other words, if you are in Spain and you're going to church, the services, the priest should be speaking Spanish. If you're in Germany, they should be speaking German, not Latin. All right. Nobody speaks Latin as a first language. And so it's much more direct. It's trying to connect directly with the people more. That third issue, who can interpret the Bible? This is the one that I want to expand out. Who can interpret the Bible? That's a sort of authority. So let's rephrase that question. Who should be trusted with authority? Okay. And I'll walk you through different types of authority. Who should be trusted with authority? What did the Catholics say? Catholic priests. In other words, a small group of elite experts. You with me so far? Who should be trusted with authority? The Catholic view is a small group of elite experts should have authority. The Protestant view is any person is capable of having authority. You see the difference? Who do you trust with certain types of power? A small group of elites or any average person? Okay. Let's think about how this goes way beyond religion. How does this Protestant versus Catholic dynamic apply to other types of authority? I want to paraphrase this again. When I say Protestant and Catholic dynamic, Protestant, by Protestant, I mean, we're going beyond religion now. By Protestant, I mean trusting the average person. And by Catholic in this context, I mean trusting a small group of elite experts. Okay. So let's keep that in mind. Do you trust a small group of elite experts or do you trust the average person with power? And let's walk through different types of power and authority. And you think about where you land on these issues. And like so many of these other issues that I'll present to you, it's not an either or. Okay. You're probably gonna have a gut reaction. I generally trust the experts more, or I generally trust average people more. You're gonna have just a natural impulse based on your own feelings. But then every situation is different. So in other words, you might say, on most issues, I trust average people, but on certain issues, I only trust the experts, right? It's a very complex issue, depending on what type of authority we're talking about. So who should have the authority to own a gun? That's a real type of authority. That's power, right? What would the quote Catholic perspective be? The Catholic perspective would be only a small group of elite experts should be trusted to own a gun. And that's how most countries operate. Almost all countries have a quote Catholic approach to gun ownership. In other words, the United States is the only major country, for better or for worse, that allows average people to own guns. In almost every other country, it's a much more Catholic approach, meaning small group of elite experts. You have to be military or law enforcement. That's it. Because most countries say that type of authority, gun ownership, that's way too much power to entrust to the average person. You understand? The United States, as you probably know, we have a very quote Protestant relationship with guns. You don't need to be an expert in the United States to own a gun. You need to be 18 years old. You need to not be a felon. That's pretty much it. You know? Um, Look, I could turn off my computer right now and drive 10 minutes down the street and to a gun store and walk out background check takes 10 minutes on the computer. I can log off from this lecture right now and have a new gun in my possession in less than a half an hour. A lot of people think that's crazy. Okay. That's where the United States comes down on this issue. We trust, for better or for worse, average people with that type of authority in a way that no other country does. Media, that's power. Who has the power and authority to inform you what's going on in the world? That's serious power. That's incredible. I cannot exaggerate how important that power is. And this is something that if you pay attention to the media, you're seeing this happen in real time right now. In our country, the issue of the media, who has the power to inform the public what's going on? In other words, who can be a reporter? Now, in the past, in this country, that was a much more, quote, Catholic thing. There was a small group of elite experts who all lived in New York and Washington, D.C., and they controlled the entire media. The New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, ABC, CBS, that's pretty much it. They controlled what you were told about what was happening in the world. Okay? Now, what's going on? Well, with social media, who can be a reporter now? Now we've gone full Protestant on this issue. Do you see? Anybody can be a reporter. You got an internet connection? You got a smartphone? Yeah, you can be a reporter. You can film things that are going on. You can interview people on the street. You can just go on YouTube and sit in your basement and talk at the screen. And if people find what you're saying interesting or important or entertaining, you're going to get more views than the New York Times, especially since Elon Musk bought Twitter. I think he said something to the effect of, "We are the media now." Any person now can be the media. You should think about that. This is a radical thing that's happening right now in real time in our country, and you're seeing it. And please understand, the old elite expert class, the quote Catholic view of media, the New York Times types, you understand they hate Elon Musk for making the media a much more Protestant, anybody can do it type thing. They hate it. The New York Times hates the fact that Joe Rogan gets exponentially more views than anyone at the New York Times ever will if they live to be 1,000 years old. They hate that. And you know what they say? Joe Rogan, he didn't go to Columbia to study journalism. He's not an expert. Okay. Cry harder, New York Times. This is the world we're living in now, for better or for worse. Okay. What the elites will always say, let's stick with the media, for example. What the elite media will always say is people that are reporting things on YouTube or on their own personal sites or on X or whatever, they can't be trusted with that type of authority. They might spread disinformation. Now, you should think about this very carefully. Is there disinformation being spread by random podcasters on YouTube? Sure. Sure. You know who else spreads disinformation? The New York Times. The New York Times. The New York Times has won several Pulitzer Prizes. That's the highest award in journalism given out by the elites to the elites. And they've won several Pulitzer Prizes for reporting that real things were fake and that fake things were real. That's a problem. So anybody is capable of misusing authority. The question is, who do you trust in your gut? Small group of elite experts, or no, open that up to everybody and just see what happens. Voting, that's a type of power and authority. Who do you trust to pick who's running the country? It's a big deal. In this country, we have a very Protestant relationship with that, right? We trust the average person. You over 18? Yeah. All right. You get to vote. You don't need to prove that you know anything about the issues. You still get to vote. Right. So I hope you see what I mean by this Protestant versus Catholic dynamic and how this debate that started in the Reformation, who do you trust with authority? A small group of elites or everybody, all average people? That goes way beyond religion. Okay. It's a fundamental thing. This country, our country, politically, ideologically, is a very Protestant country in the sense that we trust more people with more types of authority than any other country in the world by far. Okay. Let me walk you through one more example, again, of how you might plug in these ideas and how it's not all or nothing. You can have a mixed bag. So for me, and I repeat that my view should not be important to you. I just want to walk you through how some people might pick and choose here. Religiously, I'm Catholic. On all these other issues, I'm very Protestant. Personally, I want every law-abiding person in this country that wants guns to have guns. I personally believe that that would be a good thing. You might think that's crazy. That's totally fine. I get it. I personally want on the media issue, I think the elites are corrupt and incredibly biased and pathologically dishonest. I think they hate the majority of people that live in this country that actually have real jobs. And I think opening up the media to everybody, to, everyone, whatever they think, to have the ability to put their ideas out there, I think that's a good thing for democracy. I like that. Voting, I want everyone who cares enough to get out and vote to be able to vote. I'm Protestant on these issues. However, there's certain other examples where maybe we don't trust average people to have certain types of authority. Let me give you a quick example, then we'll move on. Let's see. All right, here's a type of power and authority. The authority to perform open heart surgery. I am very Catholic on that issue. I only want a small group of elite experts to be able to perform open heart surgery. If one of my children needs open heart surgery, I want the most elite of the elites of the elites. I want a surgeon that went to Stanford and Harvard. I want all kinds of diplomas on that person's wall. I don't want a YouTube star to be able to perform an open heart surgery. You understand? So every situation is different, but this is really important for you to think about to understand this country and what makes this country unique. We, for better or for worse, trust average, everyday people with authority, of different types of authority. Have a gun, start a media company, vote, right? Whatever you want to do. We're unique in that way. In this debate, do we want elite experts in charge or average people in charge? Really starts accelerating with the Protestant Reformation. Individuals may have been convinced of the truth of Protestant teachings, but territories became Protestant when their rulers decided to, because this is before the separation of church and state. So the state, the government, decides what religion the territory will be. Obviously, we've evolved past that now in our country. When their rulers decided to leave the Catholic Church, often for political or economic reasons, rather than or in addition to theological convictions. So this was a religious movement, yes, but there are a lot of economic and political ramifications to it. And a lot of times, people that left the Catholic Church did so for reasons that didn't technically have to do with religion. And here is the best, the most well-known example, Henry VIII. In England's left the Catholic Church, not because the people wanted to, but because the ruler wanted to. And why? What drove him to do so? It wasn't really theological, it was more political and personal. So let me walk you through this story really quick. The personal and political ambitions of King Henry VIII. So this is the guy with 6 wives. You probably have heard some form of this story, but I want to walk you through it because it's really entertaining, and also there's the irony of the way the story ends is pretty good. So here's how it starts. He is the Catholic king of England. England had been Catholic for 1,000 years. His wife, um, Catherine of Aragon, she had several miscarriages, several stillbirths. That was very, very common back then. She had given birth to one daughter, but King Henry and most kings during that time did not think that a daughter would be a good ruler. Didn't think a woman could properly do the job, basically. And his wife was at the point where it was clear, because of her age and her health, that she was not going to give birth to a healthy baby boy. It just wasn't going to happen. It was clear by this point, right? Several miscarriages and stillbirths, etc. And so Henry's in this position where if nothing changes, when he dies, his daughter will be in charge, and he didn't think a woman was up to the job. Keep that in mind. That's how the story starts, because the ending is ironic, to say the least. So he wants out of the marriage because he wants male heirs. He wants sons. And that's not going to happen with his wife. He wants out of the marriage, but they're Catholic, and the Catholic Church does not allow divorce. So usually in this case, with someone this powerful, they would go to the church and ask for an annulment. An annulment is kind of a loophole. It's not a divorce. It's the church saying something about the marriage. We'll find some legal loophole to say the marriage was never legitimate in the first place, therefore the marriage is dissolved. But it's not a divorce technically, because if you were never legally married in the first place, you can't get divorced, right? The Catholic Church, though, refused to give him the annulment. And in most other cases, they would have. He's a powerful Catholic leader. He's asking for a favor. But in this case, the Catholic Church refused because his wife was also a very influential Catholic ruler. She was not only the Queen of England, her parents were the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Very influential, powerful Catholic rulers. They're the ones, for example, who sent Columbus to the New World. So the Catholic Church, the Pope, is in a rough position here. If he gives Henry the annulment, he's going to infuriate the King and Queen of Spain for humiliating their daughter. You see? If he doesn't give Henry the annulment, he's going to infuriate the King of England by not giving him what he wants. So the Catholic Church does not give him the annulment. That causes Henry to leave the Catholic Church. So it's personal, it's not theological. He then starts his own church, the Church of England. He still wants to get out of his marriage. He needs to ask the leader of this brand new church, the Church of England, for an annulment. Who's going to be put in charge of the Church of England? He puts himself in charge. Isn't that convenient? So now he needs to ask the head of this new church for an annulment. Conveniently for him, the head of the new church is him. Can I have an annulment? Yes, I can. Thank me. I'm welcome. He gives himself the annulment. He dissolves his own marriage. Second wife, Anne Boleyn, he marries her. She gives birth to a daughter, so he's still kind of in the same predicament. He doesn't have a son. He proceeds to accuse her of being a witch and committing incest, and he has her beheaded in public. Third wife, Jane Seymour, she gives birth to a son. She dies shortly after from an infection. Very, very, very common back then. So now he has a son, but the frequency with which young children died back then, before the age of 5, it's heartbreakingly common. He's still not feeling secure. He wants more sons as insurance. Fourth wife, this is so good. He had never met this woman. She was from Germany. He sent his official portrait artists to Germany to paint a picture of this young woman. The artist returns with the portrait. He looks at it. He decides she is physically attractive enough for his standards. She comes to England to get married. He then concludes that the painting was misleading, that she is not as attractive in real life as she was in the painting. Shortly after the marriage, he annuls that marriage and sends her back to Germany. At least he didn't cut her head off. That's nice. Fifth wife, by this point, he's probably 50 years old and she is a teenager. He accuses her of adultery, has her head cut off. Sixth wife, by this point, he's too old and sick to really do much of anything, and she survives. So the rhyme for the six wives is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So it's just one big ridiculous soap opera. Keep in mind what started it, though, his conviction that a woman could not be an effective leader. He used the parliament in England to end the authority of the Pope and make himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Whoever didn't go along with him was killed. The most famous person he killed was Thomas More, who was the author of Utopia, that book which we covered previously. So Thomas More was a devout Catholic. He was furious at what Henry was doing. He refused to publicly support what he was doing, and he paid with his life. Most people, however, went along with what Henry was doing, even if they disagreed. Henry ended 1,000 years of Catholic landholdings in England. When he got rid of the Catholic Church, he basically stole, expropriated, seized all of the Catholic Church's land and property. And then he used that land and property to buy people off. He needed people to support him. So this is the thing. He is the king. Yes. He's the most powerful man in the country. Yes. However, it's important to understand this about rulers, whether it's a dictator, a king, a president, whatever it is. The one person in charge, they're just one person. However powerful they are, they put their pants on one leg at a time, as the saying goes. They're just people. And as powerful as Henry was, every ruler needs a certain number of people around him to support what he's doing, or else he can just be killed or overthrown at any minute. So Henry needed a lot of other powerful people to go along with his plan. The majority of them did not agree with what he was doing. They were all Catholic. They were furious at what he was doing. How did he get them to go along? There's something called the carrot and the stick. It's important for you to understand in terms of incentives and human nature. How do you get someone to do something that they might not want to do? The carrot and the stick. This goes back to an old analogy about if you are, let's say you have a horse and you want the horse to pull a wagon and the horse isn't moving. How do you get the horse to move? The carrot or the stick. First, you try the carrot. The carrot is an incentive. It's a bribe. You take a carrot, you tie it to a stick, you dangle it out in front of the horse. The horse is going to start walking towards the carrot because it wants the incentive. And once it starts responding to the bribe or the incentive because it wants that carrot, now it's pulling the wagon. Now it's doing what you wanted it to do. So that's option one. To get someone to do something, you give them a bribe or an incentive. The stick in this analogy, well, if the horse doesn't respond to the carrot dangling in front of him, you say, you know what, forget the carrot. You take that stick and you start beating the crap out of the horse until it starts moving. So the carrot is the incentive. If that doesn't work, you go to the stick. That's the threat. This is what Henry did. What was the carrot? He's trying to get people to publicly go along with what he's doing. The carrot is he will come to a powerful person whose support he wants and say, listen, you might not like what I'm doing in terms of leaving the Catholic Church. I don't care. I just need you to publicly support what I'm doing. And here are your options. Carrot, you can have a piece of land in a big, beautiful building that used to belong to the Catholic Church. You can have that and leave that to your children. Or if you don't like that, if you don't take that carrot, I'll cut your head off. You see? The majority of people said, look, he's going to do it anyway. I may as well benefit. I'll take the carrot. Some people, the minority, but some people, most famously Thomas More, refused to take the incentive and they paid with their lives. So carrot and the stick, keep that in mind. Incentive, threat. Here's how the story ends. After Henry dies, he has 3 living children, 2 daughters and a son. The daughters are approximately 30 years old and 20 years old. The son is approximately 10 years old. Who's going to be in charge? Well, based on the standards and the rules of the time, the 10-year-olds, because he's the only male. His son Edward becomes the king. That's what Henry wanted. That's what he was so obsessed with, to be succeeded by a son, and he got it. But Edward, his son, died after a couple of years being king. So within a couple of years of Henry's death, his only son is also dead, and now the whole thing was pointless. Who's left? His 2 daughters, the 30-year-old and the 20-year-old. The 30-year-old rather, Mary, becomes queen. She is the daughter of the first wife. She hated her father because she was a devout Catholic and she was her mother's daughter, and her father humiliated and abandoned her mother and desecrated her religion. She hated her father. She wanted revenge. When she became queen, she spent a lot of time rounding up and killing all the people who had helped her father do what he did. And she is known to history as Bloody Mary. She also died within a couple years. Who's left? The only surviving daughter, the daughter of the second wife, who was beheaded for being a witch. This is Queen Elizabeth I. What does she do? She proceeds to be Queen of England for about 50 years, during which England becomes the richest, most powerful country in Europe. See the irony? All of this chaos was set in motion because Henry didn't think a woman could do his job. How does the story end? With a woman being 10 times the leader he ever was. So the irony there is pretty on point. Last couple things. Let me jump ahead for a minute to see how much time we have left. Okay, what we can get done. All right, so we'll finish the Reformation and then take a break. Some rejected the idea that church and state needed to be united. Now, in the United States, most of us reject that idea, but that was a revolutionary idea back then. But this is the beginning of what eventually would become separation of church and state. Some people during this period sought to create a voluntary community of believers as they understood it to have existed in New Testament times. So this is the beginning of this movement in the West that we now, most of us, take for granted, which is the government and the religion should be separate things. Because in New Testament times, in the early days of the church, government and religion were separate things. The church was in its own sphere. It wanted nothing to do with politics. If you're familiar with any of the language, you know, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Government over here, church over here. That was a tradition in the early church, and some people here are saying we got to get back to that. We don't want government and religion mixing, right? We want them in separate lanes. That was the minority view back then. Today in the West, that's more of a consensus. The German Peasants' War. This was the largest mass uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. This was incredibly bloody. This is in Germany where Martin Luther was from. So this is now a Protestant area. And let's go back to this idea of who do you trust with authority? Small group of elites or average people? This is an example of average people, peasants in Germany, taking Martin Luther's message to heart and saying, hey, we like these ideas that Martin Luther is putting out there about normal people having authority. We like that. Let's apply that to our actual day-to-day lives. Let's rise up against the elites and try to seize political and economic power for ourselves. And they thought that Luther would support them because in their minds, they're just applying his ideas about normal people being empowered to different situations. And Luther did not support them at all. He urged the elites, the rulers, the princes in Germany to crush the peasants, to strangle and stab the insurgents as one would a mad dog. And they did. And the peasants were slaughtered in huge, huge numbers. So this is an example of this constant back and forth with these ideas that the Reformation instituted. It's all good for Martin Luther to say average people should have authority, but then he turns around and says, whoa, 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 wait a minute, not these average people. I didn't mean that. I only meant this. So these ideas, again, go far beyond religion. The successes of the Protestant Reformation led the Catholic Church to make some reforms as well. Because in business, or in this example, or in sports, whatever it is, if you have competition, and all of a sudden the Catholic Church had competition, you need to get better. You got to up your game or else you will not survive. So the theory is the Protestant Reformation led to the Catholic Church losing power, losing followers. And for the first time ever, they had competition and they understood that they needed to change. Not radically, but they needed to make some changes to convince people to stay in the Catholic Church or to come back to the Catholic Church if they had left. And they refer to this as the Counter-Reformation. So this is what the Catholics did. They're going to oppose Protestants in every way they can, obviously, intellectually, politically, military, and institutionally. But they're also going to make some changes based on the grievances or complaints that Martin Luther was making. So they're not accepting what the Protestants are saying, but they are saying, you know what, we don't like what is happening here, but Martin Luther, maybe he had some good points, some valid points. So they did do a little soul searching, pun intended, and said, hey, you know, there are some things that we do need to change because we're losing credibility, we're losing followers, we're losing support. So, you know, you can look at these. They're not big radical changes to the institution of the church, but they are, you know, marginal changes that mostly had to do with decreasing certain corrupt practices and trying to connect more with average Catholics and not taking for granted that everyone was going to stay in the Catholic Church forever. All right, so the next issue here is, so this is kind of a turning point in the middle of this unit, and we're at an hour here, so I'm going to pause there for now, and when we come back for the next section, we'll get into the Enlightenment, which is kind of a wide net of all kind of sociological and intellectual stuff that I hope you find interesting. So until then.